So we're here today, Trump Tuesday, a beautiful Tuesday in Syracuse, New York, talking about, once again, the impact of President Trump's policies on real Syracusans and the issues that real Syracusans care about. And today we're here to talk about science and the importance of science in good public policy and what happens when you don't have that. So I want to first introduce Michelle, who is going to come in. And you'll notice that our pro-science people all have glasses, so they're all super smart too to sign. We didn't tell them all to wear their glasses and their beanie hats, but apparently people who are pro-science all do that. So I want to thank them all for being here. Come on in closer. Actually, it helps with body warmth. Come on in.
Part of the uniform.
Yes. So Michelle, come on in, and why don't you introduce yourself? Hey, Michelle.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me and thanks for coming out. Hey Diane. Good to know some people in the crowd. So my name is Michelle Stanchel and I'm a PhD student at SUNY ESF and I'm also a board member of the Onondaga Audubon Society. I, as part of my research, work specifically with endangered species along the Atlantic coast, and so endangered species are really the core of what I do and what I care about and what I work very hard for. And as you might know, the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973 due to concerns that many of our nation's native plants and animals were in danger of becoming extinct. So the purpose of the Endangered Species Act is to protect and recover imperiled species and the ecosystems on which they depend. And one of the things that that means is we protect them no matter the cost. What you might not know is that tomorrow the Senate is having an oversight meeting that's entitled Modernization of the Endangered Species Act. And so right now our Endangered Species Act is being threatened by the current administration. So what can we do? I think that a lot of us often feel very helpless when we're thinking about science and we're thinking about the current administration and when we're thinking on a national level, what is it that we can do? One of the things that we can do is of course call our senators and tell them what's important to us. And if endangered species are something that we think are important and that we value, call them and let them know. And if you need a list of the people that are on that oversight committee, I'm happy to provide their phone numbers and their contact information so that you can call them. But what else can we do? I think that often, when we're feeling helpless and we make these phone calls, we don't know if we're making an impact. But one of the things that does make an impact is getting involved locally. So like I also mentioned, I'm a board member of the Onondaga Audubon Society. And we deal with a lot of local conservation issues. And for example, we have a local animal right now here in Syracuse that was once on the Endangered Species Act and that is currently using Onondaga Lake. Does anybody know what that species is? Absolutely, it's the bald eagle. So the Onondaga Audubon Society is in, we love to take people to the lake to show them these animals. They were once on the Endangered Species Act. They have made a miraculous comeback, and they're using areas right here in Syracuse, New York. And you guys can get involved locally with this issue. As a society, we very much support the Loop the Lake Trail because it brings people to the lake to experience wildlife. And we would love for this trail to be completed, but we don't want it to be completed through Murphy's Island because that's where the eagles are using during this winter period, and it's essential for their survival. So the reason that the eagles are using the lake right now is because of the open water. They can roost in the tall trees on Murphy's Island, and they can access food for foraging. And so we want to keep these animals here and protect them. So one of the things that you can do is to be involved with local conservation issues. So call Travis Glazier and call Joni Mahoney's office and tell them how much you care about these bald eagles that are right here in Syracuse, New York, and tell them that you want to protect them, and tell them that we should complete the Loop the Lake Trail around Murphy's Island instead of through Murphy's Island. And yeah, thanks. And the science shows that humans walking through an area where animals are using has more of an impact than things like vehicles, that are driving past. So the railroad that's there is noisy and loud, but vehicles don't have the same impacts to roosting birds as humans do because we pose more of a threat to the species. So that's something that you can do on a local level, is get involved in local conservation issues, because when we protect the things that are important to us at home, that's what people see on a national scale. So get involved locally, call Onondaga Audubon, come see me at ESF, and stay true to science.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Michelle. And for our next scientist, we will have Josh. Josh is right next to me. We will have Josh come and speak to the importance of science in his life and why it's important in public policy. So please, Josh.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Josh Crunland. I not a Syracuse native, but I live here now and I love it here. I got my bachelor's degree in wildlife biology at University of Vermont, and then I did my graduate work here in New York State at SUNY Brockport. I went throughout New York State studying bats, and I would actually sometimes bring my family along with me, my kids and my wife, when I would be doing my field research throughout the state. So I was the original bat dad before Bat Dad had his videos. I didn't take videos though. So that's kind of where I start from as far as my background. And, you know, in our family, we kind of have expectations. We have 3 daughters, a 6-year-old and twin 3-year-olds. So with our 6-year-old, we have certain expectations. We set the bar for her, and we expect her to be a role model for her younger sisters. And we kind of hope that they will meet or exceed those expectations, the younger ones. So if you kind of think of the federal government as a family, and the EPA being the big sister, and the federal government being the big sibling, we would want them to be the role models. Woo! We want them to be the role models. We would want them to meet the expectations so that the rest of the state governments, the younger siblings, could meet or exceed those expectations. Because if there's no expectations set for the older sibling, then it's kind of doesn't really set a good example, or doesn't be a good role model for the younger siblings. So in my field, not many people know about it. Some people do, but not many know that maybe about a decade ago we had a pretty close to massive die-off in the bat population here in New York State, and it's spread throughout the U.S. It's gone southwest and then to the west with the white nose syndrome. So people say, oh wow, really, that happened? Yeah, well, it's been going on for over a decade now. But when you say to somebody, well, do you know what a polar bear is, right? Everybody knows what a polar bear is?
Yes.
Yes, okay, good. I'm so glad to hear that. Well, the polar bear could be dying off soon. We may have to sit down with our children and say to them, I'm sorry girls, but there's no more polar bears left in the wild, because despite our best efforts to combat climate change, to combat everything that's been going on, we've lost them. We've lost them. So we would hope that we could instill in our children the idea that we have been fighting to combat climate change, but they have to as well. They have to work hard to make sure that all of our efforts don't go by the wayside. We want to make sure that with our government that wants to restrict or get rid of the EPA and restrict the Endangered Species Act, that all of our progress is not lost. We don't want to go back to a time before the EPA. I mean, we've lived it. Here in Syracuse, I mean, we don't want hazardous waste being dumped into our water. We don't want to see, like we saw in Western New York and in Ohio, we don't want to see lakes and rivers on fire anymore. We want to see the bald eagles back. We want to see all of these wonderful aspects of the natural world thrive and live and be an example. So that is what we hope to instill in our children. And I really do appreciate being invited down here by Mayor Miner and her team, so thank you so much. And we love Syracuse.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Josh. We're glad to adopt you. Welcome. Thank you so very much. And for our final pro-science scientist, but not the final pro-science person in our community, we're going to have Colin come and speak to us.
Whoa. All right. I'm a professor, associate professor of ecology. Thank you. Nice catch.
Practice.
Well, yeah, thank you. At SUNY ESF, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Mayor Miner, for inviting me. And the professor's about to talk, so if you guys fall asleep, I won't be too upset. I'll try to keep this as brief as possible. Hopefully the wind will help you stay awake. I'm going to pose a few questions that you may have heard. I've often heard them. You might have pondered them yourself, because I think we need to start a conversation, a more productive conversation, particularly as it relates to climate and more broadly in science. The first question is, hasn't Earth's climate always been changing? What's the big deal? Well, the answer is yes, Earth's climate has been changing if you take the long view. But most of what we consider civilization, including the development of agriculture, science, law, commerce, industry, representative democracy, etc., have arisen during a period where the Earth's climate has been, on the whole, rather stable and especially hospitable. Today, the rates of change in our climate that we are observing now and predicting for the next century are unprecedented at a global scale in recorded human history. Human populations have exploded since Earth last experienced climatic changes this rapid and this far-ranging. We're also now tapping into most of the resources and much of the space available on our planet. In many ways, despite our technological capabilities and despite how smart we might think we are, we're more reliant on a stable, predictable climate than we've ever been. There is less wiggle room. To me, this really highlights the very pressing need for us to learn how to adapt to the changes that are coming. Question 2. Now, wait a second. You talk about adapting to a warmer world, but we just had a few of the coldest winters that I can remember, this whole polar vortex thing. It was snowing in Georgia, right? You talk about more storms and hurricanes, but we just had the worst drought in 50 years this last summer. Do you people have any clue what you're talking about? You know, it's funny, kind of, but these are really great points, and we shouldn't laugh at them, we shouldn't dismiss them, and we certainly shouldn't ridicule them. We should engage them because they represent valuable teaching moments, and as a professor, I like teaching moments. Right? So first, we should remember the difference between weather and climate. Climate is the average, the long term, the large scale. Weather is the here and now. Climate is what you generally expect. Weather is what you get. Right? Within a given climate, we expect the weather to follow certain patterns that offer a certain range of conditions, and we behave accordingly. As our climate changes, such expectations are becoming more like risky assumptions about how things are going to go. And if we assume wrong, there are very real implications for our economy, our infrastructure, our environment, our quality of life. The same is true for our plants and animals, and the stakes are often quite a bit higher for them. For instance, our New York apple trees, the best apples in the world, right, have an expectation that when they experience a week of 70, 80 degree temperatures, it's going to be safe to wake up. Open up your flower buds and wait patiently for bees. In 2012, this week of balmy weather arrived, as you might recall, in the first half of March. 3 weeks later, the new blossoms bore the brunt of a prolonged hard frost, a week of wind, ice, and snow that caused, by some estimates, the loss of 4 out of every 5 apples produced in New York State. Some chalk this up to a late frost, which many of you, anyone who tills the soil or tends a garden, knows about late frost, especially up here. But the thing is, the frost was right on time. It was the summer-like weather in March that kicked things off weeks earlier that caused the problem. And this kind of thing is becoming more common as our climate warms. As the timing of natural processes loses its alignment with weather cues, things start to go haywire, and not just for apples. So I'll tell another story. I came here from Juneau, Alaska, and about 10 years ago. No, it's not actually. Alaska is changing incredibly rapidly, and no matter what political side of the spectrum you're on in Alaska, everybody recognizes what's happening. But I want to say, in my own work on climate change in the Alaskan rainforest, and yes, there is a rainforest in Alaska, I noticed that snowfall was experiencing a very precipitous but somewhat cyclic decline over the last 50 years, the latter half of the 20th century. And the first 5 winters of the new millennium had been the 5 of the 10 lowest snowfall winters on record at Juneau's airport at sea level, suggesting the trend would just continue to get stronger. And then in the winter of 06-07, right before I was hired to come here to ESF, the Juneau airport recorded the highest snowfall ever at that location in over 80 years. Nearly 3 feet more than the next snowiest winter back during, you guessed it, the Nixon administration. Now you wouldn't expect an Alaskan community to be unprepared to deal with snow, right? It's Alaska. You can pretty much be sure that winter's going to show up at some point, right? Well, it turns out the town was totally unprepared. After a decade of rainy and not so snowy winters, funding had been shifted away from snow removal to other priorities, and as the snow piled up, it became a costly and embarrassing mess. But can we really blame them? Although we in Syracuse won't forget about snow anytime soon, certainly, such lessons should not be lost on us. Our climate has been getting warmer and wetter for the last few decades, but the extremes and big swings between the extremes are increasing too, in some cases more rapidly than the average conditions are changing. Climate scientists say we're currently in something called a pluvial, which is an exceptionally wet period, a very wet period, perhaps the wettest overall it's been since Columbus sailed. But we just had the worst drought we've had in 50 years. On the flip side, just look at what's happening in California right now. Over a decade of the most severe drought that they've been able to measure, and what's happening? They're getting hammered with rain and their dams are failing, putting lives, communities, environments at risk. It seems that there are really good odds that we'll set new records for heat waves, intense rainfall, storm damage, maybe even drought over the next decade. But these kinds of events are really hard to predict because they are really weather. They're not climate in a lot of ways. And how many of us will believe a weather forecast more than 10 days out? They don't even give it to us more than 10 days out. Try 10 years or 50 years or 100 years. It's an area where climate scientists have a lot more work to do. So all of this leads us to the idea that our future climate could be a novel climate, something totally new, something we have never seen before. We'll see some familiar conditions, but they'll be arranged in ways that we're not used to. We might find ourselves totally unprepared. This idea of expecting the unexpected, it's really easy for me to stand up here and say that. It's exceptionally tricky to actually do. So my third and last question. Sorry if I'm talking too long. Okay, fine, we have to adapt. But what do? How do we do this? Where do we start? Adaptation is not about giving up on mitigation. Mitigation is stopping the use of fossil fuels, or at least restraining ourselves a little bit, like our 5-year-old, 6-year-old children, right? But adaptation is a strategy that recognizes both the political and biophysical realities of our present circumstance. The political reality, I won't go there, but I do think that a dialogue on how climate change is affecting everyday Americans and their livelihoods and how vulnerabilities in our economy, our health, our environment, our culture, and quality of life can be addressed could have much more traction with those currently in power. The biophysical reality is that even if we ceased all carbon emissions today, we will not stop this train on a dime. The interactions and processes that shapes Earth's climate are like a locomotive. They're hard to nudge forward, but once you get it going, it's much harder to stop. Some of you have probably heard that with atmospheric carbon dioxide rising above 400 parts per million, we are locked into some amount of change at the global level, and I think that's a safe bet. However, what that change looks like on the ground is going to vary considerably from place to place, and what that change will mean for our communities and our built natural environments will also vary. So the thing about adaptation is that it has to take place and hopefully take root at the local and regional levels. This also happens to be where real political and social change always starts. I think that's a very promising notion. New York State has the ability to lead on the science and practice of understanding and adapting to climate change, and one way to do this is to build on the investments that we've already made in this area, and I just want to mention a few. We have the Climate Report, which is a comprehensive and forward-looking, it's more than a report, it's a really comprehensive study on the impacts of climate across New York State, the vulnerabilities that we have, and adaptation strategies that we might consider. It's a really valuable resource that can serve as a springboard for many local efforts. We also have, which is currently still being developed and installed, we also have the Mesonet, which is a state-of-the-art weather monitoring network that covers the entire state from Niagara Falls to the marshes of Long Island to the high peaks of the Adirondacks. Not only does this serve as an early warning system for extreme weather, it provides very high-quality data for us to be able to measure and understand the ongoing patterns of change across the state. Lastly, we have the New York Climate Change Science Clearinghouse, which is at nyclimatescience.org, which is poised to become a regional multi-state hub for online climate data, maps, and resources for the Northeast. Massachusetts is joining this effort. Vermont is joining this effort. There's a lot to think about in our region. It's also a place where, as needed, we can archive the scientific data and regulatory documents that may be withdrawn from the public domain by the federal government in the coming years, making that information available to everyone. We must continue to look to our state leaders and congressional representatives to support the institutions that do the science, innovate the solutions, and implement the practical steps needed for us to adapt. Our research universities in particular are going to see dramatic funding cuts, and the state leadership should step in to ensure that SUNY in particular does not lose the capacity to serve the people of New York State. We can also look to innovative leaders like Mayor Miner here at local levels who are willing to try new things to help their communities and environments become more adaptive. And it's not just to climate. We have so many other challenges. But climate is a pervasive thing that affects all of us. We need an electorate also that is willing to give our leaders the benefit of the doubt when they experiment with new approaches to dealing with the complexities of change. We need to be more patient, and we need to be more participatory in all of this. In closing, to paraphrase President Obama, you don't have to acknowledge or believe that climate change exists because it's happening either way. It is not a hoax. Nature does not care about or operate on your alternative facts. Change is happening and it matters to us in many, many ways. And honestly, when it comes down to it, I think most people, including even the politicians who proclaim otherwise, know this to be true. Thank you.
Well done. I want to thank Colin and Josh and Michelle for talking to us about the importance of science and reminding us that it impacts our industries like agriculture, that feeds our families, gives people jobs, that it impacts our families in terms of whether there will be polar bears that are real, not just in Coke commercials, or whether we will actually have bald eagles. And what's more American than a bald eagle? That's what we're talking about here. This is the policies that we need. We in Central New York and Syracuse know firsthand what happens when you treat your natural resources like a dumping ground. And we've seen great progress with Onondaga Lake. We can't have that stop now because we have been taken over by people who believe that in alternative facts and don't think that science matters. I want to say a couple of things in closing to all of you. A number of you were here last week. There were some people who were Trump supporters, and I shared with them if they wanted to come back and speak, that we would allow them to speak. This is not about just having a one-way dialogue. In fact, I would like it to be an actual dialogue, not a monologue. And you have heard for the past, I guess this is our third week, real Syracusans and real people from Onondaga County talking about how these policies impact them. This is why we need to have forums like this. This is why we need to have town halls. You are not, and I'm saying this because recently I have read and I have heard that somehow these are a wild bunch of individuals who are getting paid to show up. If you guys are getting paid, then you can pay for the coffee. You can see me later. But you're not getting paid. How many of you here live in Onondaga County? These are the people who live here and are going to be dealing with the public policies. Our elected officials should have town halls so that we can have respectful dialogues. We've done that before in this community, we'll do it again. And so I would urge our congressman, enough with a town call, we need a town hall. And I'm here to say that I will speak on behalf of the people that come to Trump Tuesdays that we will be respectful, we will listen as well as speak. And we only ask for the opportunity to be heard because if you have a representative government that has representatives who don't hear you, then you don't really have the consent of the governed, do you? It's time. It's time that our leaders hear us and that they listen to how these public policies impact us, voters, constituents, people who live in this community. So thank you all for coming today. We'll be back at it next week, and we're going to continue to do this because this is what democracy looks like. Thank you.